Hello, hello, friends. Wow. Theme music. I've got theme music. That's great. How you doing there, friends? My name is Jeff Fritz. You can find me on YouTube, on Twitch, on GitHub, on Twitter, or X, or whatever he's calling it this week. You can find me on Patreon. I am C# Fritz in all the places. And today I want to talk to you about Blazor and how we can give you some of the tools, some of the techniques to allow you to write more code more faster, right? Let's build some fast and reusable content with Blazor, okay? Now, who's used Blazor here in the room? Okay, not many of you. We need to work on that. Here's the deal. Let's go over Blazor in 60 seconds. It's the next generation component-based user interface framework built with C# and Razor. It runs on ASP.NET Core Server or in the browser with WebAssembly. And we have an update coming for it, a significant update coming for it with .NET 8 next month when that's released as part of the .NET Conf virtual event. You'll be able to watch that online November 14th through the 16th. So, really cool set of features that you can use with C#. You build with Razor templates. If you're a .NET developer, you're familiar with Razor templates. Very easy syntax for you to pick up and work with. But these Razor templates are interwoven and compiled to deliver content. You install the .NET SDK. You go get that at .net online. Build your first app with .NET New Blazor WASM. WASM, W-A-S-M, stands for WebAssembly. So .NET New Blazor WASM says build a new project with Blazor and WebAssembly. Not bad. Easy to do. So we're going to build a component here today. There's a sample that ships with Blazor called Weather Forecast. It demonstrates how you fetch data from a server and interact with it using Blazor. It's some basic HTML and a little bit of C# that mixes in there to present a little grid of weather information. And all the weather information is randomly generated. It's just pitched out on the screen so you have some interesting data to work with. We're going to turn that weather forecast sample into a grid component. We're going to add some parameters, some styles, some event handlers, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to share that component between WebAssembly running in the browser, the server run on our server if it's running in a nice cloud-hosted environment, maybe on-premises, and we're also going to show you how you can use that same component on mobile applications. So that's where we're going to go. And let me start a new application and just show you that first little bit since we don't have too many folks here who are used to working with Blazor. I like to work at the command line in these demos because it's really that lowest common denominator that everybody's familiar with and everybody can work with. So here I am on my local drive. I am in Windows. This is Windows PowerShell in Windows Terminal. I have a configuration called Oh My Posh that shows some information about the version of .NET that I'm running and the Git repository that I'm living in here at the command line. So let's create a new project. Let's just start writing some content here. I'm going to create a folder to work in. Let's call it DevReach, and I'll go into that DevReach folder. There we go. And let's create a new project. .NET New Blazor WASM, and let's name this My Blazor App. So this is going to create a new project. It's going to put it down in that folder for me. There we go. And I'll create a solution file here also. All right. So this creates a solution file that I can use with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to group together my projects, make it a little bit easier to manage. Let me make sure I add that project into the solution. So I'll say .NET solution add my Blazor app, and now it's part of the solution. I'm going to open that solution now in Visual Studio to work with. So I'll just say, get it right, there we go. So I'll just say start DevReach solution, and it will open Visual Studio 2022. It'll open Visual Studio. You're mocking me. I'll click it. How's that? So I like to write code live in front of folks. I mentioned earlier, you can find me in all those different places, but in particular on there, you can find me on Twitch a couple days a week where I write code live in front of an audience. Why write code live? Because writing code live is the great equalizer. I'm not hiding anything from you. If something doesn't work, you see it. We're writing code together. If you have a suggestion to how to make things better, we're in chat together. Tell me. We can work on that. Same thing here. We're going to write this code live on stage so you can see exactly what goes into this, and you can see things, how it behaves live, and how those interactions are, and what a great productive experience it is. Because, let's face it, if I just showed you this as slides, it's boring. It's not actually, you can't actually feel and see it. But watching somebody write that code, now that is something that's going to be compelling. So let's get into this. Let me show you what this project looks like when it runs. And I'm going to run it here at the command line by dropping into the My Blazor app folder, and I'm going to use the .NET watch command. Now this command will compile and run the application, and it will watch to see if there's any changes in the files. As there are changes, it'll automatically recompile them and deploy them and refresh my browser that you see over here on the right side of the screen, because I want you to see me writing code on the left side in just a minute. So I'll open that up full screen so we can take a look. This is what the template looks like that ships with Blazor. There's 3 pages that come with this. The home page, there's a little counter over here that runs in the browser with a little bit of C#, so I can click a button and amazingly it increments a number. But this is all happening with C# in the browser. I'm not going to go too far into the Blazor mechanics behind it, but that's where it's running. That's how it's behaving. And here's the fetch data screen. This is where we're going to work. You probably saw it opened up and it showed briefly a little loading dialog, a little loading message. And now it shows this grid with a simple block of data here. And it's not interesting, right? It's just a table. Okay. Let's do something more with that. Maybe your organization has a bunch of tables and content that you deploy in your applications, and you want to have a standard look and feel. Now, of course, I'm giving a presentation about components at an event that's hosted by a component vendor. So you can wrap components, HTML tags, other things, and deliver a standard look and feel. If you don't want to just reference and say, I want to use that Telerik grid view on a page. You can wrap and put more content inside of a component that is easy for you to reuse and deploy in other places. But to make sure that we're all kind of at the same level here, I'm going to show you with just basic HTML, because we all understand HTML and tables, right? Right? Okay, thank you. Like, I'm okay if we're not all up to speed on Blazor, but HTML, come on. All right, so let's do this. I'm going to take this little grid, and it lives over here in a page called fetchdata.razor. And let's zoom in there on our code. So there's my weather forecast title up at the top, a little H1, and then you see where it pivots back and forth to C# code for those of you that aren't familiar with this type of syntax. So if forecast is null, we're going to show a little loading dialog. Wherever there's an @ sign is where it turns into C# code for a little bit, and when the C# code ends, it turns back into HTML. And that's, in 10 seconds, how you read the format here in Razor templates. Okay, I have a table with that header, a T body, and then I have a little for each statement that says for each of the weather forecasts, I'm going to format the forecast date with a short date string, temperature in Celsius, temperature in that American Fahrenheit format, and the summary. So, hey, I can poke fun at myself. I'm American, okay? So down here at the bottom, there's a collection of forecasts. There's my weather forecast object. And you see here the little bit of code that's going to go load the data from the server, some weather forecast data to present on screen. I don't want to change that. I just want to change this format up here. So let's simplify and pull this out of this screen because we know there's other grids of data that are going to be needed to be presented. Let's pull that out and put it into a component so we can reuse it. First thing I want to do, so that that weather forecast object is a little more accessible to the rest of my project, I'm going to grab this class and take it out of there, cut that, go over to my shared folder here, and I'm going to insert a new class. So I did Shift-Alt-C there to open up the templates dialog. I don't care the name of the class, just give me space there to work. I'll comment out, make the namespace a file scope namespace, and paste in my weather forecast. So save that file, and I'll do a control dot here to rename the file to weather forecast. Done, and now I can reference weather forecast through the rest of my application. I'm going to move this grid out, including this condition up here, and let's put this somewhere where we can start to reuse it. And you saw I have a shared folder over there. Shared, see it there? Let's go and create a new Razor component in there, and we'll call this grid. Okay, nothing to it, and I will just paste in that little bit of Razor markup in there, and it references forecasts. Well, we need to figure out a way to get forecasts in there. But for now, let me just save that. I'm going to move this over to the side of the screen, put the weather forecasts over there on that side, and just shrink it down a little bit. And you can see over here, my watch process is saying, hey, a lot of files changed in here. Do you want me to restart the app? Yes. But it's going to come back and say, I've got some errors. I don't know what forecasts are. We need to be able to reference and work with that inside my grid. So that takes me to my next slide. Let's just stay with this view. I don't need it full screen. So we're going to start to pass in parameters. That data that I want to present in the grid, it's a parameter. It's something we're going to pass in and work with on our grid, right? I don't want to have to load everything in that component. So pass in a parameter, some configuration, some information that's going to allow the grid to grow and consume that information. So I'll set up a little forecasts property inside my grid that will be received. By decorating this property with the parameter attribute down here in this code block, what it will let us do is reference that parameter as an attribute on a grid tag. Let me show you. So let's punch in weather forecast, and we'll call this, I'm not even going to call it forecast, let's call it items. Because we know at some point we're not going to be receiving just weather forecasts. But for right now, I'll just call it items. And I'll make that items here, and up here, I'll call that items as well. So it's still, right? So I saved my fetch data page, and it recompiled properly, and now, okay, I removed my grid from the weather forecast page, so let's put it back on there, right? So back over to fetch data. I'll create some space here, and let's put grid. See, it knows what grid is, and I can specify items, cool, and I'll pass in forecasts. Save, and it refreshes, and on the side, my grid is back. I've got my basic table. Great, right? I did all that work, and I'm right back where I started from. But this is just the beginning, because we're going to introduce some more component features here as we're going along. All right, back to the slides. So we have a parameter now that lets us pass that in. Next, we have content that we want to pass into our components as well. You might have some markup you want to pass in from outside of it, right? You want to template some of that information. So the way to reference and access all of the content from between the start tag and the end tag, right? Everything in between those two tags is called the child content. And there's a standard property you set up with a render fragment property type that will receive that. It's a parameter that will take in that child content, and you can then reference and place it with that syntax you see at the bottom, @child content. Place it wherever you'd like, and it'll just render and place it there. So let's go back over to the page, because what I'd like to do is take this content right here, this loading block, I'd like to move that over to right here so that I can pass in that term appropriately. Now, I'm getting an error on my web page because it doesn't know what to do with that stuff yet. I haven't set up the inside of the grid. So let's set up that child content parameter here. So I will define another parameter, and I will make this a public render fragment, child content, and I can go back up here and just say at child content. Come on now. Save that, and it will rebuild. And now, you didn't see it come up, but it was there. So let's flip this so that we can force it to always appear. I'll save that, and now you see it just says loading. But I can pass in now something that's more appropriate for my weather forecasts. Loading forecasts from the National Weather Service. And it immediately appears, and I have a customized message that makes more sense for that display. Now, that's not the only template and information I want to pass into a grid, right? There's all kinds of other things that we want to configure when we think about building and using a grid component. So let's actually put this into a loading template property. Now, our parameters that we receive, not only can they be attributes like the items that we see here on line 10, but I can also create child elements that are those same properties and parameters for us to consume. So I'll just wrap this with a loading template element, and we will create a loading template property. So I'll just change this to loading template, and down here I'll change that from child content to loading template. Save that, and it reloads, and it's misbehaving just a little bit, but there we go. All right, we're all good. That is a remnant. I will .NET clean. Look at all that. And we will .NET watch again. And this will restart, and we'll have a nice clean weather forecast showing for us. Ta-ta-ta. There it is, with no errors at the bottom. Okay, so now we've got a little bit of a way to customize and pass in some text for that loading. What else can we customize and do here? So I'm going to go back over to these slides. And yes, I apologize for the recording that I am showing the previews on the left, but we're going to get through this a little bit faster instead of trying to pivot back and forth. So we showed a render fragment, but we can also have templated components that take in a type. Now that becomes a little bit more interesting because then I can work with the types of the content that we're actually working with. So on our components, we can add a type param directive up at the top of the Razor file, along with some variable ID that we're going to give it. Most folks have it start with T to stand for type, right? And we can use that to start working with the various types inside of our grid or other components. Now, that's just the start of what we might want to do here, because what I want to do is I want to customize the columns of my grid from outside the component, right? That's going to get a little weird because I need to pass in information about what a weather forecast is and configure each of the columns using this type of type parameter interaction so that it reads and presents and formats properly, right? When we look at the date that's being presented there, it's in American short date format because that's the way that I read dates. The temperature Celsius, temperature Fahrenheit, and summary, those are all kind of pretty well just copied out there. But I need to do a little bit more to get some of that formatting out there. So we can also include and use something called cascading parameters. And this is a way for you to define a parameter, some sort of a property or a setting in a top level page or component, and it's made available to all containing components that live inside that page or Razor component. So it uses a very simple syntax. Instead of a parameter like you saw me use, we use cascading parameter. I like to pass a name in just to make sure that is uniquely identified. And we pass it into other components by wrapping those components with this cascading value element that you see there. So I define the name of the value I'm passing and the value that I'm going to pass through it. Okay? Additionally, we can also cascade the types that we're working with in our components. So we can add this cascading type parameter and pass that through so that the type parameter for our grid also is inherited by our columns. That kind of makes sense. If I'm working with weather forecast elements on my grid, I don't want to be working with orders or products on the columns in that same grid. It should be the same type as the grid is receiving. So I can use this attribute cascading type parameter along with the name of the cascading type parameter we want to bring along. I'm using t-row type here in this demo code. The type parameter has to have that same name in both the parent element and in the child component. So let's go take a look at that. Oh, one more thing before I write this with the columns. There are 3 major events that are available to you in Razor pages and components: on initialized, on parameter set, and on after render. And when you work with these, the on initialized only fires once, but the others may trigger multiple times. If you have your component re-render, or if you have parameters get set on your component multiple times, they can trigger multiple times. So on after render also takes in a Boolean parameter that indicates if it's the first time that it's been rendered. Let's add some columns to our grid now. So I have my grid here that we can start working with. Well, I want to receive a columns element here, right? I probably want to have something that looks like this and define some columns that live inside that. Because columns is going to just contain other elements, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to define that columns is just a render fragment. And we'll do some work with that in a minute here. So we'll have a public render fragment called columns. And I'll make that get set. So now, excuse me. So now these columns, the red line goes away because that's actually a legitimate parameter on my grid. But what I'd like to do next is actually define a column, and inside that column, be able to do something that looks like what we have here. The forecast date, all that information. So I'm just going to copy this out from here. And I want that to run here. Now, the grid component doesn't know what a forecast object is, but when it's working with objects that are in that type parameter context, I can use context, and it will allow us to work with these. So I'll just copy that in, and I want each one of these elements here, I want these to be columns. So I'm going to make them the column element. You like that? That was vertical select in Visual Studio. So I'll do the same thing with the closing tags here. So I'll just put column. Now it still doesn't know what column is. I'm really doing a little bit of coding ahead of time here, and I'll write that column element next. So that's what I want my code to work. That's how I want it to behave. And of course, .NET Watch is over here saying, I don't know what this is. You got to write some code still. So let's do that. So I'll go back over here and in my shared folder, let's add a new Razor component. And I will, of course, call this column. And inside of here, well, I need to be able to capture that template, right? So we'll have a parameter, and this is going to be a public render fragment of, I don't know, it's going to be some grid item type, right? And this is the child content. So now it knows how to work with that. I need to define that type. So we'll put that right up here, T grid item. okay? So it knows that I have this type parameter on this component. We're gonna receive the content that's inside the tag to work with. So my grid doesn't have that data anymore, and fetch data, now it really looks like a mess. All right, we got more to work with and fix here. So it doesn't know what some of these things are. It knows what columns is, but it still doesn't quite know what to do with that. So down here, right, there's my columns. It's a render fragment, but we need to figure out and do something with this. And if I go back over here, look at all these errors. So our grid needs to have a type as well to pass along, doesn't it? So let's add that type parameter up here, and I will call it tGridItem. And I want to pass that same type into my columns. So I need to have that attribute, and cascading type parameter, there we go. And the name is tGridItem. So by adding that, now my columns that are inside of this are going to receive when they have the same type parameter name, tGridItem, and sure enough, they do. They'll receive that same type that's being passed in. And the list that's being received here, the collection that we're working with, well, those are of that same generic type. And now we got our first recompile. Fantastic. There's no data. Okay, but it knows what columns are and it knows what forecasts are because they're being passed in from outside our component. This is good. Let's move on. So my columns, I want to get the data painted on the screen here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a cascading parameter to pass a reference about the grid into the column so the column can send information back to the grid about here's what's been requested. Let's take a look through that. So first thing I want to do is I want to set up a private list of type column, and columns are of type tGridItem. Oh yeah, when you've got generics of generics, that's powerful programming. So this is my column list, right? And I'll just make this a new list here. So it's just a private field hanging out there. I'm going to set up an internal method that will add columns to that list, right? We don't want to give direct access to that list. It's right. We want to maintain some concerns here, manage them well. So I'll define my column that we're going to add to the list, and it is, thank you, tGridItem, and I'll call this new column. So when I add that column, all I'm doing is, of course, column list, add, right, new column. And when I add those, I should update the grid and notify that there's information here we should repaint. So let's say state has changed, and that will update and paint those columns appropriately, and we're still not there yet. All right, here we go. I need to pass information about the grid into those columns, and we learned about cascading parameters. So let's create a cascading value here, and we will call it grid. And the value we're going to pass along is this grid. And we're going to pass that into all of the columns that were listed inside that render fragment. So now it's going to pass that information along, and I get, well, that's not right either. But that's okay, because our columns each have this H3 in them. Well, I don't want that H3 to appear from those columns. I want to output some information that's appropriate for each one of those table cells. So I'll clear that out and save, and it'll refresh, and now we don't have that weird column. So I want to receive a cascading parameter for the grid. There we go. And this is going to be a public grid of type tGridItem, and I'll call it, sure, let's call it grid. Okay. So when I receive that information, now why don't you like that? Does not contain a constructor that contains, we're okay. This should be name. There we go. Okay, so when our columns are initialized, we need to pass information back to the grid about our column. So let's override the onInitialized method here, the event. And what I'll do is I'll just say grid.add column this. So it's going to add the columns to the collection. As the column gets initialized, we're still not there yet. All right. Next thing. So I now have my collection of columns available to me. So here on the row, I can do a simple for each var column in that column list, that collection that we've just loaded up. And for each one of those, I'm going to output, here we go, column, and I want to pass in the data to render is going to be the forecast. I'm sorry, column child content. There we go. Save that. He needs this one for the birdie, and there we go. We got our data back. So now we've templated our grid entirely so that all of that information is coming from our component that we reference on the page way over here. Let's also add a header property to that, because let's face it, we don't know what the headers are there, and we've hard-coded these properties up here. So let's add a header to this. So if I just want to create header text and say date, right? I can do the same thing for these others, and we can say temperature in Celsius, and let's do header text, temperature in American units, and header text equals summary. Now it doesn't know what header text is yet, so let's add that. See, error, doesn't know what it is. So we'll just add another parameter. But this is an easy one to work with because it's just a string. So I'll create that string called header text. And back over in my grid, I'll just replace these with a little for each, right? Come on now. In column list, and we'll put a little wrapper there, and we'll just say at column, that one, header text. There we go. And now we should get, there it is rebuilding, and it looks the same. So let's change this. I'm going to make this, instead of summary, description, just to show you that it is in fact coming in from the outside. So that will hopefully restart. Nope. It gets stuck on this part of the demo every time. So here we go. It's going to restart, and come on. Come on. Yeah, there it is. Now it says description. Okay, so I'm passing in my header information now from my page, all right? We've done a lot now to make this really convenient and easy to use, but there's more. I've still got 7 minutes. There's more. Let's do more, right? All right, let's do some more. I don't like that these are just white rows here. That's boring. I want to put that description in. I like to use some CSS styles here, and this is where Catherine's going to cringe, because I'm going to use some ugly colors here. Let's make the background color blue. Let's make the color white, because those are the school colors for my university. So there we go. That's the color I want the description, but it doesn't know what to do with that style. That style thing, right? I got an error here. That's not a parameter on my component, but those types of things like style and class and all those fun CSS things that our designers help us with, I want them to be able to pass in and control and use them just like they're used to. So that's where the next feature comes in, called attribute splatting. Trust me on this one, okay? When you let developers name features, we name stuff splatting instead of Microsoft Feature 2022 Release 2, okay? Attribute splatting says capture all the other unmatched values on this element and stuff them into a parameter, into a property inside this C# object. And we're going to make it easy to access because, let's face it, the attributes on an HTML element really are a dictionary, right? It's a collection of items that are identified with a string with some object in quotes, right? So that's what we do here. And you can name that dictionary property whatever you'd like. You can then reference and splat it. Take that dictionary and kind of smear it like finger paint all over the HTML element you want by using this @attributes attribute. And it'll take the contents of that, and anything that doesn't match, it'll put out there as other attributes inside that element. So that's what we want to do for our styles here. So let me go back to the column, and let's add another parameter here. And I will use the capture unmatched values configuration and say, yes, please capture that. And come on, Copilot. No, Copilot's not going to help me. Oh, you're killing me here. So it is a string object dictionary, and I'm going to call this additional values. And there it is. So now I can take that and splat it inside my grid wherever I have this TD. So I can say @attributes equals column dot additional values. I'll save that. We'll let it rebuild and redeploy, and on the right side, we should see some blue descriptions pop up right there. So now I can pass in not just style, right, but I can also do things like width, right? Any attribute that you have on your HTML elements, you can, of course, work with and deploy and push that into the content, right? And that's not going to quite look right unless I expand this a little bit. It'll finish, and we're going to end up with wider descriptions. Okay, that's nice. We've done something interesting there. I've got 4 minutes left. I want to give you more features. What do you say? Yeah. All right. So let's do this. What about if I had a common look and feel, a common style sheet for my grid that I want every grid in the organization to have, right? So that folks like Fritz, when he comes by and he says, I'm going to make it blue. No, you can't do that. So what I can do is I can add what's called isolated CSS to my grid that will carry through and set configuration and style for everything inside that grid component. I forgot I have a slide for this. So starting with .NET 5, if you add a file to your project with the name, whatever your component is, .razor.css, the CSS rules that are in that file only apply to that component and its child components. So let's do that. I'm going to go back over here, and inside my shared folder here, I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to add grid.razor.css, and I'm going to add TD, and let's make this, I like dark theme. So let's make background color, we'll make it 333, and we'll make the color echo, echo, echo. Save that. Now, I added a new file. So I actually need to restart the watch process here. It says it hot reloaded, but the web browser doesn't pick it up with the current version of hot reload. And there it is. Now I have my dark theme grid that's been put together and made available because I set this TD. Okay. Now, there are ways to hook up and isolate and attach JavaScript to these. I'm not going to get into them, but the sample code I'm going to give you at the end has that in the demo. I want to make sure that you know that's possible as well, because the last piece that I want to show you here is that I'm going to take this grid and move it out into a library in another project. So we'll add a new project here. And there's my Razor class library. So I'll call this my library. I'm going to start a company, My Library Components. And I'm going to delete all the other things that are in here because I don't need them. I'm going to pick up my grid and my column through the grid there, cut them, go down here to the library, paste them in. There we go. And up here on my Blazor app, I am going to add a project reference to that library. There it is. Add it in. I'll go into my imports, and just to make sure that it knows that it's there, it is using my library. There we go. And after it takes a second here, yes, I know, you don't know what that is. We'll .NET clean one more time. .NET watch. Come on. Oh, come on now. Come on now. Rebuild and clean that one out. There it is. There it is. Oh, look at that. I'm running out of time. Thank you. Yes, I knew you couldn't copy the file. And there we go. And now it runs, and my grid is coming in from that library right there. Okay. Can I have 2 minutes? Okay. So let's go and just put the cherry on top. Let's add another project. And this time, I'm going to add a .NET MAUI application. All right? So .NET MAUI lets you build applications that run natively on Windows, Mac, iOS, and Android. Okay? So I'm going to build, I only have the stuff for Windows here, so I'm going to build for Windows. And this is a Blazor hybrid application. There's my MAUI app, and you see it has fetch data in there. Well, I'm just going to right-click on MAUI app, and I can add a project reference to that same class library, bring that in, and I'll go over to my other fetch data here, where I use the grid, and I'm going to copy that syntax and go to my new fetch data that's being used with .NET MAUI and remove all that boilerplate code. Paste in my new code, and I need one more change. I need to reference and tell it using my library. And I'm going to change now so that we start the .NET MAUI app for Windows. Here we go. This is it. Can we make it? Restoring the NuGet packages. You see it down there in the bottom corner. It's working hard, doing the thing. And we need to clean. We need to clean solution. Cancel that. Come on now. Come on. What do you mean clean failed? I told you to delete everything. Come on now. No. Give me, release that compiler and come on. The state of some of these things gets stuck. Try that one more time. Build started. Here we go. I'm feeling good about it this time. I didn't feel good about it before, but I feel better about it this time. So, yes, I am new to .NET MAUI. Thank you for asking, because I'm a web guy, and I can build native applications now. And nope, it's not going to run. So we'll just have to go over to the one that I built earlier and show that one again. Because I already have it sitting here and working with .NET MAUI. So I'll just run this one that does the exact same thing, has the exact same demo built from my practice session earlier. There's the deploy. And now it's running as a Windows app. See, don't you see it? There we go. Right? So it's running in debug mode. I go down to fetch data, and there's my grid. This time it has a blue background that's been set by default everywhere. So I built one component. I reused it for the web, for a mobile app, for a Windows app, and I can package and reuse this in any other application that I want. So I'll leave you with some notes, some resources available for you here. So check out, make sure you go to learn.microsoft.com. That has all the documentation that you need about working with Blazor and working with .NET MAUI in this Blazor hybrid model. All the information about Blazor, and I know some of you are just getting started with it, check it out at blazor.net. The demo that you saw, all the source code for it, including additional demos where I show how to turn it into a PDF, are available on my GitHub, github.com, C#Fritz/Fritz component demo. Components demo, that's plural. Thank you so much for having me. I hope to see you on Twitch, YouTube, GitHub, wherever. Thank you so much.